The dust of Kandahar still clung to my boots, or so it felt, as the taxi pulled up to where home should have been, my home. The place I'd poured my blood, sweat, and deployment pay into. The place where Sarah and I had planted that damn oak tree, the one that was supposed to outlive us. Instead of the familiar lines of my two-story colonial, a sprawling, aggressively beige edifice of consumerism clawed at the sky. Willow Creek Galleria. My stomach turned to ice, then to fire. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a prank. This was erasure. I stood on the pristine sidewalk, the scent of hot asphalt and corporate landscaping choking me, my duffel bag a lead weight at my feet. They hadn't just taken my house. They'd paved over my life and built a monument to their avarice. My first call, a bewildered, choked query to the mall information desk, yielded a chirpy teenager who probably thought HOA stood for Happy Ostrich Academy. My second, to the county clerk's office, was met with the bored monotone of bureaucracy, a voice that informed me, after an eternity on hold, that Lot 47, Block D, Willow Creek Estates, was now part of a consolidated commercial parcel. Sold, legally, apparently, while I was dodging IEDs and fighting for something I believed in. These hyenas, these domestic cannibals, had been busy carving up my American dream. The anger was a living thing, coiling in my gut, cold and precise. This wasn't just about property. This was about violation. This was about the absolute, contemptuous desecration of everything I held sacred. My training, the kind that teaches you to observe, to analyze, to act with lethal efficiency, kicked in. The grief was there, a raw, gaping wound, but it was being cauterized by a purpose so intense it felt like a physical force. They thought I was just another name on a deployment roster, another faceless soldier. They had no idea. They had no fucking idea. The initial reconnaissance was a blur of anodyne corporate facades and the smiling, hollow faces of people who had no clue they were standing on sacred ground, my ground. I found the developer's name easily enough. Apex Commercial Holdings, a bland, ubiquitous entity. But they were just the hammer. I needed the hand that swung it. And that hand, I suspected, wore the cheap, power-hungry rings of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I remembered the passive-aggressive newsletters, the petty tyrannies over lawn height and fence stains. I'd dismissed them as nuisances then. Now, they felt like the early warning signs of a cancer that had metastasized. The drive to the Willow Creek HOA office, a small, self-important building at the edge of what used to be a quiet residential area, was fueled by a righteous fury I hadn't felt since my first firefight. The air conditioning in the rental car blasted, but it couldn't touch the inferno raging within. This wasn't just about a house. It was about a line crossed, a fundamental trust broken. They had declared war. They just didn't know their opponent. I walked into their little fiefdom, the scent of cheap air freshener and desperation thick in the air. A woman with a helmet of hair sprayed into immobility and eyes like a predatory bird looked up from her meticulously organized desk. "Can I help you?" she chirped, a smile that didn't reach her cold, assessing gaze. Karen. It had to be. The legendary HOA president, the queen bee of petty regulations. The nameplate confirmed it. Brenda, call me Karen Lipton, president. The universe, it seemed, still had a penchant for dark, situational irony. I kept my voice level, a parade ground calm that belied the tempest inside. "I'm here about my property, Lot 47. The one you apparently sold to build a shopping mall." Her smile faltered, just for a nanosecond, before snapping back into place, tighter this time, sharper. This was just the overture. The symphony of destruction I was about to compose in her name would be a masterpiece of legally lethal precision. They hadn't just demolished my house. They'd demolished my patience, my tolerance for the mundane evils of the world, and they were about to learn that some sleeping dogs, when kicked, don't just bite. They orchestrate your annihilation. The first tremor of the coming earthquake was the almost imperceptible flicker in her eyes, a brief spark of something that might have been recognition, or perhaps just the annoyance of a tyrant whose authority was being questioned. It didn't matter. I had her scent now. And I would not stop until I had dismantled her world, brick by fraudulent brick, just as they had dismantled mine. The opening act of this tragedy was theirs. The rest of the opera, however, would be mine to conduct. The county records office was a mausoleum of forgotten transactions, smelling of decaying paper and bureaucratic indifference. I spent days there, my eyes gritty, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a burning methodical rage. Each document, each signature, each notarized lie was a nail in their coffin, though they didn't know it yet. Brenda Karen Lipton's signature was a flamboyant, self-important scrawl, appearing with sickening regularity on notices of violation, liens, and finally, the foreclosure documents. The violations were ludicrous, manufactured out of thin air, unapproved atmospheric displacement for a wind chime I'd hung before my last deployment, excessive solar reflection from a window Sarah had insisted on, non-compliant arboreal silhouette for the oak tree, our oak tree. It was clear they'd papered my absence with a blizzard of fraudulent claims, each one timed to expire unanswered, triggering the next step in their predatory legal dance, the auction. A sham, of course. Held on a Tuesday morning, with minimal public notice, attended by exactly one bidder, a shell corporation, Willow Creek Development Partners, LLC, whose registered agent was none other than Karen Lipton's brother-in-law, a man whose previous business ventures included selling artisanal, red, counterfeit pet rocks in the 90s. The connection to Apex Commercial Holdings was murkier, buried under layers of holding companies, but the stench of collusion was unmistakable. I pulled satellite imagery archives, my house standing proud. Then, a few months into my deployment, the first signs of neglect, feigned, I was sure, to justify their claims. Then, the heavy machinery. The demolition. A brutal, swift erasure. My stomach clenched as I watched the time-lapse, my sanctuary reduced to rubble, then to a graded, barren lot, and finally, to the concrete foundations of that damned mall. They'd even had the gall to send certified letters detailing my abandonment of the property to my APO box, knowing full well the delays and inconsistencies in wartime mail delivery. Some probably never reached me. The ones that did, I'd dismissed as more HOA harassment, filed away to deal with upon my return, never imagining the insidious endgame they were pursuing. My old neighbors? Some were ghosts, their numbers disconnected, their new addresses unknown. A few, however, I managed to track down. Fear was a common thread. Whispers of Karen Lipton's iron-fisted rule, her vindictive nature, her uncanny ability to make life hell for anyone who crossed her. One elderly gentleman, Mr. Henderson, his voice a dry rasp over the phone, told me, "She's got connections, son. Local council, the zoning board, they all eat out of her hand. Tried to fight her once over a bird feeder. Cost me $5,000 in fines and a new fence." His words painted a picture of a petty tyrant who had somehow, through a cocktail of narcissism, manipulation, and carefully cultivated local corruption, turned a suburban homeowners association into her personal kingdom, a vehicle for her insatiable greed. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just an opportunistic land grab. This was a coordinated, premeditated act of grand larceny, orchestrated by Lipton and her cronies, facilitated by a system either too incompetent or too corrupt to stop them. The moral violation was absolute. They hadn't just stolen land, they'd stolen a future, a piece of my soul. The rage was still there, but it was now a cold, hard diamond at the core of my being, focusing my thoughts, sharpening my resolve. They thought they were untouchable. They thought their paper fortress of legal chicanery was impregnable. They didn't understand the concept of asymmetric warfare. They didn't understand that I was now operating on an entirely different battlefield, with rules they couldn't even comprehend. My next calls were, not to lawyers, not yet. They were to shadows, to whispers in the digital ether, to men and women who owed me markers, people for whom data acquisition was an art form. My sidekick in this unfolding drama wasn't a conspiracy theorist, but something far more effective. A former signals intelligence analyst, Echo, who could make data sing or scream, depending on what was required. Echo, with his almost supernatural ability to navigate the labyrinthine pathways of the internet and unearth buried secrets, was my first recruit in this undeclared war. His response to my initial terse explanation was a low whistle. "They picked the wrong guy to screw with, brother. Let's go hunting." The hunt was on, and Brenda Lipton, currently basking in the glow of her ill-gotten gains, had no idea the hunter was now the hunted. Her meticulously constructed world of petty tyranny and grand fraud was about to experience a level of scrutiny it could not possibly withstand. The initial investigation was complete. The target was acquired. The mission parameters were clear: retribution, absolute and unequivocal. They had crossed a line. It wasn't a metaphorical line drawn in the sand of suburban disputes. It was a physical, emotional, and moral boundary they had obliterated with the casual arrogance of true predators. The destruction of my home, the erasure of my family's sanctuary, the theft of ground consecrated by memory and future dreams. This was not a slight to be answered with strongly worded letters or a drawn-out civil suit that would bleed me dry and grant them a sliver of legitimacy they didn't deserve. This demanded a response of a different magnitude. This demanded a reckoning. My father, a Green Beret who'd seen his share of treachery, had a saying: "When they take what's yours, you don't just take it back. You take everything they have, and then you salt the earth." He hadn't meant it literally. Not always. But the sentiment, the unyielding resolve, resonated deep within me now. The house wasn't just wood and nails. It was a legacy. It was where my grandfather, a carpenter, had taught my father his trade. It was where my mother had planted roses that bloomed defiantly every spring. It was where Sarah and I had whispered promises under the summer stars, planning a life that now felt like a phantom limb. This was intensely personal. The legalities were a battlefield, yes, but the war was for the soul of that memory. The dormant authority within me, the part that had been forged in the crucible of command and conflict, stirred, then awoke with a cold, clear focus. They thought they were dealing with a disgruntled homeowner. They were about to discover they had poked a hornet's nest connected to a much larger, much more dangerous hive. My initial calm, the one I'd worn like a flak jacket during those first days of shock and investigation, began to morph. It wasn't dissipating, it was consolidating, hardening into something akin to the eerie stillness before a perfectly executed demolition. Explosive emotional undercurrents still roiled beneath the surface. Grief, betrayal, a searing hatred for their casual cruelty. But they were now fuel for the engine of retribution, not a distraction. I spread out the plat maps of Willow Creek Estates on the cheap motel room table, the garish floral bedspread a mocking counterpoint to the grim geometry of my stolen life, the mall a cancerous bloat on the landscape. The surrounding homes, a silent, complicit audience, or perhaps future collateral. My mind, trained for tactical analysis, began to see not just a subdivision, but a target environment. The HOA's power was localized, built on a foundation of petty rules, intimidation, and the inertia of its residents. But its vulnerabilities were systemic, tied to the very legal and financial structures it had exploited. That was where the first strike would land. The surprise reversal wouldn't be that I was fighting back. They probably expected that on some level, anticipating a weary, underfunded legal challenge. The surprise would be the way I fought. This wouldn't be a frontal assault through the predictable channels. This would be an insurgency, a campaign of 1,000 cuts, leveraging every ounce of my training, my contacts, my unyielding will. I began to draft a plan, not just for legal recourse, but for total dismantlement. Step 1. Secure the perimeter. Legally, this meant finding a lawyer who wasn't just competent, but a shark, someone who understood the stench of corruption and relished the fight. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by local good old boy networks. Step 2. Intelligence gathering. Phase 2. Echo was already peeling back the layers of Apex Commercial Holdings and Lipton's personal finances. But I needed more. I needed ground truth. I needed to understand the network of enablers that allowed a petty tyrant like Lipton to wield such destructive power. Step 3. Psychological operations. The residents of Willow Creek were living under an oppressive regime, whether they admitted it or not. Fear kept them silent. But fear could be a weapon, and it could be turned. Step 4. The federal angle. Lipton's fraud was audacious, but was it big enough to attract federal attention? Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, potentially RICO, if a pattern of racketeering could be established. This was the long game. The kill shot. My family. Sarah. The thought of her face when I'd have to tell her, truly tell her what had happened, that our home was gone, replaced by a monument to greed, that was the sharpest spur. This wasn't just for me. It was for her. It was for the life they had tried to steal from us. The absurdity of it all was a dark, bitter humor that settled in my bones. An HOA president, a suburban Napoleon, thinking she could wage war on a soldier and win. The sheer, unadulterated hubris of it. She had mistaken my absence for weakness, my silence for surrender. She had no concept of the kind of patience, the kind of strategic thinking that deployment instills. You learn to wait, you learn to watch, you learn to choose your moment with surgical precision. My moment was coming, and it would arrive not with a whimper, but with the full, unbridled force of a carefully planned, ruthlessly executed counteroffensive. They had crossed the line. And in doing so, they had unwittingly signed their own death warrant. The transformation from reluctant warrior to avenging angel was complete. The only question now was how thoroughly I would salt the earth once I was done. Assembling the arsenal for this unconventional warfare required more than just legal documents and righteous anger. It required the right people, the right tools, and a mindset that saw the law not as a shield, but as a weapon. My first call was to a name whispered in certain circles, a legal hyena named Marcus Thorne, known for his scorched earth tactics and his allergy to bullshit. Thorne wasn't cheap, and he wasn't pleasant, but he was effective. I laid out the basics, the fraudulent foreclosure, the land theft, the deployment. His initial response was a cynical grunt. HOA disputes are messy, soldier, usually not worth the powder. Then I mentioned them all, Apex Commercial Holdings, the shell corporations, the potential for a much larger, more systemic corruption. I saw a flicker of interest in his eyes during our video call, the predatory gleam of a shark scenting blood in the water. Send me everything you have? He'd rasped, his voice like gravel. If there's meat on these bones, we'll feast. While Thorne sharpened his legal knives, Echo was already deep in the digital trenches. He was more than tech-savvy. He was a digital wraith. He moved through encrypted servers and firewalls like a ghost, his methods questionable, his results undeniable. Lipton's financials are a Gordian knot of shell companies and offshore accounts, boss, Echo reported, his voice buzzing with the thrill of the chase. Apex is dirty, real dirty. Looks like they've used similar tactics before. Smaller scale, but this is their magnum opus of scumbaggery. And guess what? Some of their seed money traces back to entities with interesting international connections. Nothing you'd want your HOA president associated with. This was gold. This elevated the fight beyond a local dispute. This had the potential to attract bigger predators. My next asset was less conventional. I needed eyes and ears on the ground in Willow Creek. Someone who understood the micropolitics of the neighborhood. Someone who could gauge the fear and resentment simmering beneath the surface. I found him in Barney Pruitt, a retired postal worker and self-proclaimed local historian who had a long-standing, deeply personal feud with Karen Lipton over the color of his garden gnomes. Barney was eccentric, a bit of a conspiracy theorist. He believed Lipton was secretly breeding surveillance squirrels, but he was also observant, well connected with the neighborhood's undercurrent of dissent, and, most importantly, he hated Karen Lipton with a passion that bordered on religious fervor. She called Bartholomew, a particularly flamboyant gnome, an affront to community standards, Barney fumed during our first clandestine meeting in a dimly lit booth at Denny's. That woman is a blight, a menace. If you're planning on taking her down, son, I'm your huckleberry. Barney became my informal psyops consultant and intelligence gatherer. He knew who was disgruntled, who had been fined unfairly, whose prize-winning petunias had been mysteriously poisoned after a complaint to the HOA. He was a walking, talking archive of Lipton's reign of terror. The plan began to solidify, a multi-pronged assault. Thorne would lead the legal charge, filing lawsuits that would not just seek damages, but aim to pierce the corporate veil of Apex and expose the fraudulent conveyance. Echo would continue to dig, looking for the silver bullet, the irrefutable evidence of criminal conspiracy that would bring in federal investigators. Barney would be my agent provocateur, subtly fanning the flames of discontent within Willow Creek, turning the silent majority into, if not active rebels, then at least a source of leaks and information. My role was conductor, strategist, the unseen hand guiding the pieces on the board. My military training was proving invaluable. This was an operation, pure and simple. Target analysis, asset deployment, risk assessment, contingency planning. The dialogue between us was terse, tactical. Thorn demanded precision in facts. Echo delivered data dumps that required careful sifting. Barney provided colorful, if sometimes rambling, intelligence reports. My inner monologue was a constant stream of strategic adjustments, weighing options, anticipating Lipton's moves. She was arrogant, overconfident. She would underestimate the storm gathering around her. The sheer audacity of her crime was her Achilles heel. She believed her local power base made her invulnerable. She couldn't conceive of an enemy who operated outside her sphere of influence, who could bring forces to bear that she couldn't control or intimidate. The dark situational irony was rich. The very tools of order and governance she had twisted for her own gain, legal notices, corporate structures, community regulations, were now being re-engineered to dismantle her empire. The on-screen text of my life became a blur of draft legal filings, encrypted emails from Echo detailing offshore transactions, and Barney's handwritten notes on Lipton's daily routines and suspected informants. Each piece of information was a bullet in the magazine. The legal siege was about to begin, but this was more than a legal battle. This was a moral crusade, cloaked in the guise of tactical retribution. And I, the reluctant warrior, was fully committed to seeing it through to its devastating conclusion. The arsenal was assembled. The soldiers were in position. The war for Willow Creek was about to enter its active phase. The first salvo was fired not with a bang, but with the crisp, official rustle of legal paper. Marcus Thorn, true to his reputation, didn't just file a lawsuit. He unleashed a legal broadside designed to shock and overwhelm. A multi-count complaint naming Karen Lipton personally, the Willow Creek HOA, Apex Commercial Holdings, the Shell Corporation Willow Creek Development Partners LLC, and every individual whose signature appeared on the fraudulent documents. Charges included conspiracy, fraud, unjust enrichment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a petition to invalidate the sale of my land due to gross irregularities and criminal misconduct. Thorn, with a flourish of deadpan sarcasm that I could almost hear in the meticulously crafted prose, described the HOA's actions as a masterclass in predatory governance, so brazen in its contempt for legal and moral norms as to constitute a veritable caricature of malfeasance. The language was designed to sting, to provoke, but more importantly, to lay the groundwork for piercing the corporate veil and holding individuals personally liable. Copies were served with theatrical precision. Lipton received hers at an HOA board meeting, mid-sentence in a diatribe about unapproved mailbox colors. Witnesses, courtesy of Barney's network, reported she turned a shade of puce, usually reserved for non-regulation lawn ornaments. The representatives of Apex Commercial Holdings were served at their gleaming corporate headquarters, a process server navigating the marble lobby with the grim determination of a man delivering a particularly unwelcome plague. The initial reaction from Lipton and her cronies was predictable. Dismissive bluster, threats of countersuits for defamation, pronouncements of their legal invincibility. Karen, in an emergency HOA newsletter leaked to me by Barney within minutes of its distribution, decried the lawsuit as a frivolous and vindictive attack by a disgruntled former resident who clearly fails to appreciate the tireless efforts of this board to maintain our community's high standards. The sheer, unmitigated gall was breathtaking. She was doubling down on her narrative of righteous authority, a delusion so profound it was almost pitiable if it weren't so destructive. But the legal filings were just the overture. Echo, meanwhile, had unearthed a series of emails between Lipton and a vice president at Apex, emails that were, to put it mildly, damning. They discussed, in thinly veiled language, the expedited acquisition of my property, the unfortunate necessity of the foreclosure, and the mutually beneficial outcome of the subsequent sale to Apex. There was even a reference to a facilitation fee paid to an unnamed local consultant, a fee that conveniently matched a large, unexplained deposit into a numbered account Lipton controlled through yet another shell. This was the ammunition Thorn needed to escalate. He filed for emergency injunctions, discovery motions demanding access to every financial record, every email, every communication related to the sale. The pressure began to mount. Whispers started in the Willow Creek neighborhood. Barney reported that attendance at HOA meetings dwindled, that residents were suddenly too busy to volunteer for committees. The fear Lipton had cultivated was now tinged with uncertainty. Her power, once absolute, was showing cracks. We began a campaign of strategic leaks. Anonymized copies of the most egregious fraudulent violation notices, along with excerpts from the lawsuit, found their way into neighborhood mailboxes, onto community bulletin boards, both physical and digital. The narrative was shifting. Lipton was no longer the unassailable queen. She was a defendant in a serious fraud case. The local newspaper, initially hesitant to touch a story involving powerful local figures, began to sniff around, prodded by Thorne's carefully worded press releases and the sheer theatricality of the allegations. The visual cues were stark. On-screen text of Lipton's increasingly panicked emails to her lawyer, obtained through means Thorne didn't ask about and I didn't specify. Screenshots of bank transfers. Violation notices with impossible dates and forged signatures. The smash cuts in my mind were the small victories. A judge granting Thorne's motion for expedited discovery, a key Lipton ally suddenly resigning from the HOA board, for personal reasons, a nervous tremor in Lipton's voice during a recorded deposition, a copy of which found its way to me. Her narcissistic facade was beginning to crumble under the relentless, methodical assault. The deadpan sarcasm in Thorne's legal briefs was a thing of beauty. He referred to the HOA's record-keeping as a masterwork of obfuscation, rivaling the labyrinth of Minos in its complexity, if not its intellectual rigor. He described Lipton's explanations as possessing a dreamlike quality, untethered by the mundane constraints of factual reality. Each filing was a precisely aimed shot, designed to expose the corruption and the absurdity of their defense. This was Phase 1, the legal siege. Its purpose was not just to win in court, but to soften the target, to expose its vulnerabilities, to create the conditions for the next, more decisive phase of the operation. Lipton still believed she could fight this on her turf, with her rules. She hadn't yet grasped that the game had changed, that the battlefield was expanding far beyond the confines of Willow Creek and its compromised local institutions. The local corruption ties were beginning to unravel, filaments of connection leading from Lipton to certain zoning officials, to council members who had benefited from Apex's community development initiatives. The righteous fury that had propelled me was now a cold, controlled burn, fueling a campaign of relentless, surgical precision. The initial blows had landed. The enemy was wounded, confused, but not yet defeated. It was time to escalate. The local skirmish was progressing, a war of attrition fought in courtrooms and through discovery motions. Thorne was a bulldog, tearing into their defenses, exposing inconsistencies. But Lipton and Apex had deep pockets and a network of local influence that, while fraying, still offered resistance. It was time to pivot, to escalate the conflict to a theater where their parochial power meant nothing. It was time to bring in the big guns. Federal intervention. My time in the military had taught me many things, among them the intricate dance of bureaucracy and the specific pressure points that could make the federal behemoth stir. Echo's findings were crucial here. The offshore accounts, the hints of international money laundering connected to Apex's seed funding, the use of U.S. mail and wire communications to perpetrate the fraud. These were the hooks. Boss, Echo had said, his voice tight with excitement a few days prior. Apex isn't just playing dirty in Willow Creek. They have a pattern. And some of their bigger developments, they're on land that might have, let's just say, environmental sensitivities that got mysteriously overlooked. And some of their funding has passed through banks flagged for suspicious activity by FinCEN. This was more than I could have hoped for. This wasn't just HOA fraud. This was potentially organized crime, money laundering, and environmental malfeasance on a scale that would make federal agencies sit up and take notice. My legal ally, Thorne, while a master of civil litigation, knew his limits. "If you've got credible evidence of federal crime, soldier," he'd advised, his usual cynicism tempered with a hint of something like respect, "you don't walk into the local FBI field office like you're reporting a stolen bicycle. You prepare a brief. A comprehensive, meticulously documented, undeniable brief. And you find the right door to knock on." I knew a few doors. Not through official channels. I wasn't about to pull rank or call in active duty favors for a personal vendetta, no matter how justified. But I knew people who knew people. Retired agents, former prosecutors, individuals who now worked as consultants, who understood how to package information for maximum impact, who knew which U.S. planks best at her. Attorney's office was hungry for a complex white-collar case, or which EPA division was looking to make an example of developers flouting environmental regulations. My sidekick, Echo, compiled the digital evidence into an unassailable package. Timelines, flowcharts of money transfers that looked like a wiring diagram for a small city, server logs, deleted emails he'd miraculously resurrected. Barney, bless his gnome-loving heart, had even contributed by diligently documenting every instance of suspicious dumping or unusual runoff near apex construction sites around the county, complete with photographs and sworn affidavits from equally disgruntled, and now emboldened, neighbors. The brief was a masterpiece of cold, factual indictment. It laid out the systematic fraud against me, then connected it to a broader pattern of predatory practices by Apex, lubricated by Lipton's local corruption, and potentially funded by illicit international money. We highlighted the mail fraud, the wire fraud, the potential RICO violations, the environmental red flags. The Step 1, Step 2 of the plan was clear. 1. Compile irrefutable evidence. 2. Package it for federal consumption. 3. Deliver it through a trusted, credible intermediary to the right federal agency. 4. Let their institutional momentum take over. The visual for this phase wasn't zoom-ins on local documents, but rather flowcharts connecting shell corporations across continents, satellite imagery highlighting potential environmental damage near apex sites, and the cold, hard text of federal statutes. The drone surveillance was no longer just metaphorical. Echo had even managed to acquire publicly available, and some not so publicly available, aerial footage of apex projects that showed troubling discrepancies from their approved plans. I made the call to a former JAG officer I'd served with, now a partner in a DC firm specializing in government investigations. I didn't ask for favors, just advice. I laid out the scenario hypothetically at first. His interest piqued. "If what you're suggesting is even half true," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "this isn't just a local HOA tiff. This has legs, serious legs." He agreed to review the brief. A week later, he called back. "I've passed it to some people," he said, his tone implying, "people who can make things happen. No promises, but they're intrigued." The calm of the predator. Lipton and Apex were fighting a war on one front, convinced they were dealing with a single, albeit persistent, gnat. They had no idea a far larger, more powerful force was now assessing them from a distance, a force that could bring resources to bear that would make their local influence look like a child's sandcastle against a tsunami. The surprise reversal was in motion. They thought it was about a house. It was about to become about their entire criminal enterprise. The turning their entire subdivision into a federal training ground wasn't a literal plan, not yet. But the principle was the same: to bring such overwhelming legitimate force against them that their entire corrupt ecosystem would collapse. The federal government, for all its flaws, possesses a singular ability to seize assets, to condemn land for public use, especially when national interests or gross criminality are involved. If Apex and Lipton's fraud was as extensive and tied to illicit finance or critical environmental damage as Echo suspected, then the ground beneath Willow Creek was far from stable. The seeds of federal intervention were sown. Now we waited, continuing the local fight. while the larger gears began to grind, unseen by our adversaries. The federal gears, once engaged, ground with a slow but inexorable power. The initial intrigue reported by my DC contact morphed into a preliminary inquiry, then a full-blown investigation. Agents from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, along with investigators from the EPA and even FinCEN, began discreetly pulling threads. Lipton and Apex, still bogged down in Thorne's relentless civil litigation, remained blissfully unaware of the much larger storm gathering on the horizon. They were swatting at flies while a hurricane was making landfall. Barney, my eyes and ears in Willow Creek, became an invaluable if unwitting asset to the feds. His meticulous, if eccentric, records of Lipton's abuses and his photographic evidence of suspicious activities around Apex sites provided a goldmine of localized detail that corroborated the broader financial and environmental concerns. He reported seeing men in dark suits asking quiet questions around the neighborhood, a development that filled him with a mixture of conspiratorial glee and patriotic fervor. The suburban horror turned war zone was becoming less metaphorical, not with gunfire, but with the chilling efficiency of federal power. Subpoenas began to arrive, not just from Thorne's office, but bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice. The scope was terrifyingly broad, demanding access to years of financial records, communications, planning documents. Apex's lawyers, accustomed to steamrolling local opposition, found themselves facing seasoned federal prosecutors who did not bluff and could not be intimidated. Lipton's reaction, as reported by Barney, who had a cousin working in the mailroom of her lawyer's office, was one of escalating panic. Her rants about government overreach and persecution became legendary within the firm. The carefully constructed image of the benevolent community leader was shattering, revealing the grasping, terrified fraud beneath. Then came the pivot point, the development that would truly transform Willow Creek. Echo, in his relentless digital archaeology, uncovered something monumental. Apex, in its rush to acquire and develop land, had falsified environmental impact reports on a massive scale, not just for the mall built on my land, but for several other large tracts they were developing, including areas adjacent to a critical watershed and, more damningly, a buffer zone for a nearby, unassuming but highly sensitive, federal communications array. This wasn't just about financial fraud anymore. This was about national security and critical infrastructure. This was the lever. Suddenly, the idea of turning the subdivision, or at least significant parts of it, into a federal training ground or a federally controlled buffer zone moved from the realm of vengeful fantasy to distinct possibility. If Apex's developments were found to have compromised or endangered critical federal assets or resources due to fraudulent assessments, the government had broad powers of eminent domain and seizure. The narrative I had carefully constructed for the federal authorities now had an undeniable national security component. The protagonist, me, was no longer just a wronged individual. I was the whistleblower whose personal tragedy had inadvertently uncovered a far greater threat. The federal agents, initially focused on white-collar crime, now included stern-faced individuals from agencies whose names weren't usually spoken aloud. They weren't just looking at balance sheets. They were assessing security vulnerabilities. The dramatic lighting change was palpable. The dim, grubby world of HOA corruption was suddenly illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of federal scrutiny. On-screen text in my mind shifted from Lipton's panicked emails to copies of federal statutes regarding the protection of critical infrastructure, eminent domain clauses, and asset forfeiture laws. The fences that Lipton had so meticulously regulated, the symbols of her petty control, were about to be dwarfed by far more imposing barriers, erected by an authority she could not challenge. The residents of Willow Creek, the silent majority, were now caught in the crossfire. Some, like Barney, were ecstatic, seeing the downfall of their tormentor. Others were understandably anxious, their property values, their way of life, suddenly uncertain. Thorne and I worked to ensure that any legitimate homeowners caught in the fallout would be treated fairly, distinguishing them from the architects of the fraud. My quiet, firm directions were now to my legal team and contacts. Focus the federal pressure on Apex and Lipton's criminal culpability. highlight the national security and environmental risks, and let the government's own protocols for remediation and asset seizure run their course. The mall, that monument to their greed built on my stolen land, became a focal point of the investigation. Was it structurally sound? Were its permits legitimate? Had its construction compromised the nearby federal array? The questions were no longer about HOA violations, but about systemic, high-level corruption with potentially dire consequences. The operation was entering its endgame. The ground game wasn't about me physically reclaiming anything. It was about the federal government reclaiming compromised territory, neutralizing a threat, and in doing so, serving a far greater justice than I could have achieved alone. Lipton and Apex had built their empire on a foundation of lies. That foundation was now crumbling under the weight of federal law, and the edifice of their corruption was about to come crashing down. The takedown of Brenda Karen Lipton was not a cinematic explosion, but a slow, agonizing public immolation orchestrated with the cold, surgical precision of federal justice. The arrest warrant, when it finally came, was for a raft of charges: mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, money laundering, and, the icing on the cake, violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO Act). Apex executives were rounded up in coordinated early morning raids. But for Lipton, the architect of my personal hell, the authorities, perhaps at the subtle suggestion of someone in the U.S. Attorney's office who had read my initial brief with particular interest, chose a more public venue. She was arrested at the Willow Creek Community Clubhouse during the annual Spring Fling Barbecue, an event she lorded over with regal condescension. Barney, naturally, was there, ostensibly manning the hot dog stand, but actually providing a live, gleeful commentary to me via burner phone. "They're walking her out now, boss," he whispered, barely able to contain his mirth. "Oh, the look on her face. It's like she swallowed a hornet's nest. She's trying to pull the 'do you know who I am' card. It ain't working. Not with these G-men. They look like they eat nails for breakfast." The visual was deeply satisfying. Lipton, her face a mask of outraged disbelief, her perfectly coiffed hair slightly askew, being led in handcuffs past the stunned faces of her former subjects. The Queen Bee, dethroned and humiliated, her reign of petty tyranny and grand larceny brought to an ignominious end. The news headlines, both local and, increasingly, national, were brutal. HOA president indicted in massive fraud scheme. Suburban mall development linked to corruption, potential national security risks. Pillar of community or predatory fraudster. Her carefully cultivated image shattered into a million pieces. The legal ally, the assistant U.S. attorney handling the case, was a young, sharp, no-nonsense woman who, in her press conference, laid out the charges with chilling clarity. She spoke of a web of deceit, of exploitation of trust, and of a cynical disregard for the rule of law. She didn't mention me by name, but she alluded to the courageous individuals who came forward to expose this corruption. Lipton's final desperate pleas were for naught. Her attempts to leverage local contacts, to call in favors, were met with stony silence or hastily disconnected calls. Her network had evaporated, its members either facing their own indictments or desperately trying to distance themselves from the stench of her downfall. My inner monologue during this phase was a quiet acknowledgement of justice served, but also a somber recognition of the sheer effort it had taken, the depths to which one had to dig to unearth such entrenched wrongdoing. There was a grim satisfaction, yes, but no elation. The cost had been too high. The public embarrassment of the villain was complete. The local corruption ties she had so carefully nurtured were now being systematically exposed, leading to resignations on the town council, investigations into the zoning board, and a general housecleaning of the Augean stables of Willow Creek's local governance. The locked gate, the visual metaphor for psychological closure, slammed shut on Lipton's reign. She was now just another defendant, her power gone, her future a bleak landscape of courtrooms and potential prison time. The climactic confrontation wasn't a face-to-face screaming match. It was the silent, inexorable machinery of the federal justice system grinding her down, a far more effective and enduring form of poetic justice. My role was now that of an observer, a witness to the consequences I had set in motion. The righteous fury had cooled, replaced by a cold, hard sense of finality. The mall, the catalyst for all this, stood as a tainted monument. Its fate was now in the hands of the federal government, likely to be seized as an asset of a criminal enterprise, its future uncertain. But its symbolic power, for me, was broken. It was no longer a symbol of my loss, but of their arrogance and ultimate defeat. The rhetorical flourish to punctuate justice was not mine to deliver, but the government's in the form of indictments, asset seizures, and the promise of lengthy prison sentences. My vengeance was not hot and immediate, but cold, calculated, and ultimately outsourced to an entity far more powerful than I. And that, in itself, was a form of victory. The war for Willow Creek was effectively over. The enemy was vanquished, her empire in ruins. What remained was the aftermath, and the rebuilding, not of a house, but of a life. The aftermath was a landscape irrevocably altered, both physically and psychically. The righteous fury had ebbed, leaving a somber resilience in its wake. Willow Creek Estates was no longer the manicured, tightly controlled domain of Karen Lipton. It was now, in part, a federal concern. Due to the extent of Apex's fraudulent environmental reports and the proximity to the sensitive communications array, a significant portion of the land, including the parcel where my house once stood, and the now infamous Willow Creek Galleria, was declared a federal interest. The mall itself, a tainted asset, was seized under RICO statutes, its doors shuttered, its vast parking lots eerily empty, a concrete ghost town. There was talk of demolition, of remediation, of turning the entire compromised area into an expanded, secure buffer zone for the federal facility. The federal training ground idea had, in a way, come to pass, not as a place for military maneuvers, but as a sterile zone, a testament to the consequences of unchecked greed and corruption. My family, Sarah, had been my anchor throughout this. The conversations had been hard, explaining the loss, the betrayal, then the slow, methodical campaign of retribution. She'd seen the toll it took, the cold fire in my eyes, but she'd also seen the unwavering protective loyalty that fueled it. We wouldn't rebuild on that stolen, desecrated ground. That chapter was closed, sealed with the grim satisfaction of justice, however hard won. The blood in this war was metaphorical, the emotional cost, the time lost, the innocence shattered. But the victory, while somber, was real. The neighbors in Willow Creek had mixed reactions. Many, like Barney, were relieved, celebrating the end of Lipton's tyranny and the exposure of the local corruption she embodied. Others, whose properties were adjacent to the newly expanded federal zone, faced uncertainty, though the government, prodded by Thorne, who had pivoted to representing a class of genuinely wronged homeowners, seemed inclined towards fair compensation. My inner monologue was one of reflection. The tactical ops metaphor had played out. The mission was accomplished. But the cost of eternal vigilance, even on the home front, was starkly clear. The porch light, that symbol of home and return to control, wouldn't be relit on Lot 47. But a new light, a new sense of control, was kindled within me. Control over my own narrative, my own response to injustice. I looked at an old photo of our house, the oak tree, a mere sapling then. The ache was still there, a dull throb of loss. But it was now overlaid with the understanding that some things, once broken, cannot be perfectly mended, but their destruction can be avenged, and new foundations can be laid. The symbolic revenge tied to family legacy had found its resolution. The legacy wasn't in the soil of Willow Creek anymore. It was in the unyielding spirit that refused to be broken, that fought back with intelligence and precision. It was a legacy of resilience, of standing up to bullies, whether they were on a foreign battlefield or in a suburban HOA office. The slow-burning moral authority I felt wasn't arrogance, but a weary understanding of what it takes to confront and dismantle entrenched wrongdoing. It required patience, resources, an unflagging will, and a willingness to walk a path that was often dark and lonely. The public reckoning had been for Lipton and Apex. My private reckoning was with the pieces of myself that had been forged and hardened in this fight. I was changed, undoubtedly. More wary, perhaps. Less tolerant of petty abuses of power. But also more certain than ever of my own capacity to endure, to strategize, to overcome. The psychological closure was a quiet settling, like dust after a controlled demolition. The fight was over. The enemy was neutralized. The territory, while scarred, was secured. Now it was time to look forward, to build something new, on ground unburdened by the ghosts of theft and betrayal. The legal revenge thriller had reached its denouement. The tactical justice fantasy had played out in the stark reality of federal power. The suburban horror had indeed transformed into a war zone, and then into something resembling peace, albeit a heavily guarded one. The new beginning wasn't a return to how things were. That was impossible. The scars remained, a reminder of the battle fought and the cost incurred. But they were not debilitating wounds. They were marks of survival, of resilience. My new purpose wasn't as dramatic as another military deployment, but it was informed by the same principles: vigilance, preparedness, and an unshakable commitment to justice. However small or large the scale, Sarah and I decided to move, to find a new plot of land, far from the tainted memories of Willow Creek. We found a place in the foothills with actual trees, not just approved arboreal silhouettes, and neighbors who valued privacy over conformity. We would plant another oak, not as a replacement, but as a new symbol, one of hope and fresh starts. The legal and financial fallout from the Willow Creek scandal continued for years. Lipton, after a lengthy trial, was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to a significant prison term, her appeals exhausted. Apex Commercial Holdings was dismantled, its assets seized and liquidated to pay fines and compensate victims, including a substantial settlement that found its way to us, facilitated by Thorne, who had developed a grudging respect for my methods. Echo, my digital ghost, went on to use his talents for a cybersecurity firm, occasionally sending me cryptic emails about interesting anomalies he'd uncovered in the dark corners of the web. Barney Pruitt became a local legend in what remained of Willow Creek, the gnome-loving oracle who had helped bring down a tyrant. He even got a commendation from the town's new Reformed Council. Sometimes, I would drive by the perimeter of the expanded federal zone. The mall was gone, demolished. The land was slowly returning to a more natural state, monitored by unobtrusive sensors and the occasional patrol. It was a stark, quiet place, a monument to greed undone. A final, dry, deadpan comment often came to mind. For all her meticulous planning of petty tyrannies, Karen Lipton had utterly failed to account for the one variable that could unravel her entire world. An opponent who wouldn't just play by her rigged rules, but who would rewrite the entire game. My intensely personal battle had, in the end, served a larger public good, exposing a cancer that had spread through the community. That was a source of grim satisfaction. In my final inner monologue, as Sarah and I surveyed the land where our new home would stand, I thought about the nature of justice. It wasn't always swift or clean or even fully restorative, but it was necessary. And sometimes, achieving it required a kind of cold-blooded calm, a willingness to escalate, to employ legally lethal tactics when faced with morally unflinching evil. You won't believe what happened, perhaps, or the lengths to which one might have to go, but it did happen. They crossed a line they should never have crossed. They took something that wasn't theirs to take, and in doing so, they unleashed a force they couldn't comprehend and couldn't control. The lesson, if there is one, is this: never underestimate the resolve of someone with nothing left to lose, especially when that someone has the training, the intelligence, and the unyielding will to see the fight through to its ultimate, devastating conclusion. My war was over. But the warrior remained, forever changed, forever watchful. The porch light of our new home, when it was finally built, would shine as a beacon, not of defiance, but of hard-won peace and the enduring power of standing your ground, even when that ground has been stolen from beneath your feet. The first-person retaliation opera had reached its final quiet chord, a testament to the fact that even the most entrenched tyranny can be brought down by a single, determined, and strategically minded individual. And sometimes the most effective weapon is not a gun, but a meticulously crafted legal brief, a well-placed piece of intelligence, and an absolute refusal to surrender.